Hello, welcome to Varn Solo, and today we venture back in to the culture of narcissism. I'm going to read two sections and we're going to discuss them about how they imply things about today and what maybe we can pull out of them. This is from The Culture of Narcissism, American Life in the Age of Diminished Expectations by Christopher Lasch. This is the 2016 edition. We start on page 96 if you want to follow along. In this read along, my children. Sorry, part of me has to go into the old preacher's voice. Politics as spectacle. Systems analysis and social accountants take as an article of faith that, with the growth of the complexity of society, as one of them, Albert Biederman, once put it, immediate experiences with its events plays an increasingly smaller role as a source of information and basis of judgment, in contrast to symbolically mediated information about these events. But the substantiation of symbolic and mediated information for immediate experience, of pseudo events for real events, has not made government more rational and efficient, as both technocrats and their critics assume. On the contrary, it has given rise to a perverse air of unreality, which ultimately befuddles the decision makers themselves. The contagion of unintelligibility spreads through all levels of government. It is not merely that propagandists fall victim to their own propaganda. The problem goes deeper. When politicians and administrators have no other aim than to sell their leadership to the public, they deprive themselves of intelligible standards by which to define the goals of specific policies or to evaluate success or failure. It is because prestige and credibility have become the only measure of effectiveness that American policy in Vietnam could be conducted without any regard to the strategic importance of Vietnam or the political situation in that country. Since there is no clearly defined objectives in view, it is not even possible to say how to defeat our victory was to be recognized, except that American prestige must not suffer as a result. This is me intervening. If this sounds like Iraq, and the Vietnam War and the Iraq War are very, very different in substantive groundings, but the American policymakers' attitude towards it is very similar. Or Afghanistan, or even maybe America's involvement in supporting Ukrainian government, period. Just not to make a moral judgment on the Ukrainian cause. It's just to say that what's driving this is often optics. Back to the book. The object of American policy in Vietnam was defined from the outset as the preservation of American credibility. This consideration, which amounts to an obsession, repeatedly overrode elementary principles of statecraft as avoidance of excessive risk, assessment of the likelihood of success and failure, and the calculation of strategic and political consequences of defeat. The art of crisis management, now widely to be acknowledged to be the essence of statecraft, owes its vogue to the merger of politics and spectacle. Propaganda seeks to create in the public a chronic sense of crisis, which in turn the expansion of executive power and the secrecy around it. Again, me interjecting. Think about how many times that we're discovering that every single major executive official seems to have classified documents just in their house, because there's probably so many classified documents and no one even knows what they are. The executive then asserts his presidential qualities by conveying his determination to rise to the crisis, whatever the crisis in the moment happens to be, to run risk, to test his mettle, to shrink from no danger, to resort to bold and decisive action, even when the occasion calls for prudence and caution. The careers of both Kennedy and Nixon testified to the prevailing obsession with crisis management and their management of impressions. Kennedy, in his eagerness to overcome the impression of weakness left by the Bay of Pigs fiasco, itself a product of a haunting fear that the Cuban Revolution had undermined American prestige in Latin America, blustered against Nikita Khrushchev in Vienna, proclaimed Berlin the greatest testing place of Western courage and will, and risked nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis, even though the Soviet missiles in Cuba, deliberately provocative as they were, in no way altered the military balance of power. In many ways, the most important event of the Kennedy administration, however, its high point from everything else was a decline, was the inaugural a spectacle solidified in the myth of Camelot before Camelot even came into being. Think about the Obama administration. Quote, "The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by hard and bitter peace." In these words, Kennedy invoked his preoccupation with discipline testing and tempering on behalf of a whole generation's belief, so soon shattered that it did poison the brick of greatness. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. No other president exemplified so completely the subordination of policy to national prestige, the appearance and illusion of national greatness. With Nixon, the politics of special reached its tragicomic climax. Oh, Christopher Lasch, if only you knew where it was going to end. Back to the text. Uninterested in the principles and programs, driven only by ambition and vague resentment against the Eastern liberal establishment, Nixon devoted most of his career to the art of impressing an unseen audience with the powers of leadership. The turning point of his career, the crises of which he has written so revealingly, present themselves as occasions in which he was tempted to quit the field but survived, in each case through a public performance, by demonstrating his ability to rise to the occasion. With this theatrical conception of politics, Nixon prided himself on the ability to distinguish a convincing performance from a poor one, as in his case, when he became certain that Whittaker Chambers was telling the truth, because I did not feel like his performance was an act. After watching the Army McCarthy hearing on television, he remarked scornfully, "I prefer professionals to amateur actors." During his famous kitchen debate with Nikita Khrushchev, Nixon was sure that Khrushchev was going through an act, and later reproached Marshal Georgy Zhukov with underestimating the intelligence of the Soviet people. They aren't dumb. They know when someone is acting and when it's the real thing, particularly when the acts have been so amateurish. In one of his televised debates with Kennedy in 1960, Nixon denounced Kennedy for demanding more active support for anti-Castro forces in Cuba, the very strategy that was secretly being carried out, partly at Nixon's own instigation, by the Eisenhower administration. Even more remarkable than this performance itself, in which Nixon formulated the most telling criticisms of policy, which he himself was in complete agreement, is the detachment from which Nixon discusses it in 6 crises. Pause while I'm reading. How much of Joe Biden's immigration policy is Trump's policy with better grammar? Ask yourself, why have, despite the crises on the border, why has the detainment and deportation regime pretty much continued unabated, but this time without the spectacle of liberal and left opposition? Did Biden secretly agree with Trump and his nationalistic concerns? Was this part of how he appeased labor? And was the liberal opposition purely about optics? I'm not here to draw conclusions from you, because we can't know in any individual person's soul from what they do not write. But I do think the parallels are clear. And that's despite the fact that I actually am one of the people who interprets this book, Culture of Narcissism, as being about the culture of the end of Fordism, in the beginnings of neoliberalism, not our culture, where we are watching neoliberalism shift and mutate into either a new form of what we already have or something quite different. Back to the book. He comments on his own performance with the same objectivity in which he comments on the performance of Hiss and Chambers, noting with some pleasure, but with complex indifference to the irony of the situation, that he spoke the exact opposite of the truth so effectively that several liberal papers strongly commended him and even forced Nixon to modify his own position. As president, Nixon inherited the domestic tensions and confusion that had been generated by the cultivating spectacle of the 60s, the war in Vietnam. He did not limit himself, however, to attempts to stifle the opposition and destroy the left. Instead, he mounted a full-scale attack on a single individual, Daniel Ellsberg, and instituted an elaborate security program to prevent further leaks of what was regarded as a vital security information, and convinced himself that Ellsberg was somehow in league with the leading Democrat contender for the presidency. These security measures, though highly irrational, probably originated in not unreasonable belief that presidential power had come to rest on the ability to manipulate information, and that this power, in order to be completely effective, had to be recognized by someone else as indispensable. Once Watergate became a full-fledged crisis, Nixon devoted himself to convincing the nation that he would by all means prove equal to the emergency. To that end, he approached the mounting difficulties with the problem of public relations. In long conversations, his chief advisor, himself a public relations man, both Nixon and H.R. Haldeman, showed an indifference to the truth that goes beyond cynicism. And by the way, as I am injecting now, we would love this much deference to the truth now. Think about the politicization of COVID under Joe Biden. After all, did the CDC under Biden do what the Trump CDC could not? And yet opposition to it, while it was existent on the left, was largely downplayed. And have not the deaths under Biden been greater than that under Trump? Yes, it may have been worse if Trump had won the presidency, but that is a counterfactual at this point. Let us get back. An indifference can be explained only by the assumption that of the concept of truth for men exercising irresponsible powers had lost most of its meaning. This is a quote. I think we have to find a way to make statements, Nixon said at one point, any kind of statement as general as possible so that people can say that a statement has been made through the president upon which he can base his statement to the effect that the confidence in his staff, I didn't do this, I didn't do that, da 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 da. Heidemann didn't do this, Eric Lynn didn't do that, Colson didn't do that. Heidemann's reply, I wouldn't say that this is the whole truth. Evinces a lingering capacity to distinguish between truth and falsehood, but does not alter the fact that the words chosen purely for public effect quickly lose all reference to reality. Political discussions can be founded on such principles degenerated into meaningless babble, even when they are carried on behind closed doors. Now we have to ask ourselves as we reach the end of this section, and I'm going to read one more section, so we'll stop here on this, and we'll go to the next one, because the next one's about radicalism and left politics, and even can be applied to right politics now, in so much that right politics has radicalized along the same lines. But we have to ask ourselves, why have we accepted, since television, the presidency as optics controlled? We don't ask ourselves the rationality of that. In fact, we prefer increasingly that this be factored out to a largely unaccountable administrative state. Now, unaccountable with broad directives from the public in lieu of legislative fiat from Congress, but still largely unaccountable. And instead of dealing with that, our legal apparatus has to toy with removing the administrative state entirely and farming out to a dysfunctional Congress that it knows is dysfunctional. But why? How did we get here? What in capital in our current society enabled that? Why is this the personality trait in the media organization that dominates? The questions that Lasch wants us to think about, we have to think about thoroughly. Section, next part, radicalism as street feeder. This is on page 100 and goes through page 103. Radicalism as street feeder. The generation of politics and the spectacle has not only transformed policy into publicity, the base political discourse, and turned elections into sporting events in which each side can claim advantages of momentum, it has also made it more difficult than ever to organize political opposition. When the images of power overshadow reality, those without power find themselves fighting phantoms, particularly in a society where power is likely to present itself in the guise of benevolence, where the government seldom resorts to naked use of force. It is hard to identify the oppressor, let alone personify him, or to sustain a burning sense of grievance in the masses. Let's pause there. Think about how you aren't mad that Sam Bankman-Fried, for all of his scanning and FT's cryptos, was being supported by people like Nate Silver and gave like the second largest donor to the Democratic Party. Now, a lot of crypto scammers were also donating to the Republicans. This is not to call it one partisan side or the other. It's to ask you why no one faces accountability for that. And the elephant in the room here is Joseph Epstein. How many famous figures in science, in academia, and in politics that we all still know are implicated by the Epstein affair? So much so that it seems logical for conspiracy theories to constantly be generated from it. And yet, the conspiracy theories don't really get to the crucial problems of power. After all, how could such a thing be amassed in the first place, where it can all happen in the open? Let's get back here. In the 60s, the New Left attempted to overcome this insubstantiality of the establishment by resorting to the politics of confrontation. By deliberately provoking violent repression, it hoped to forestall the co-option of dissent. This dramatized official repression, however, imprisoned the left in the politics of theater, of dramatic gestures, of styles without substance, a mirror image of the politics of unreality, which should have been the purpose of the left to unmask. Theoreticians of the Cold War saw the tactics of escalation as a means of impressing relevant audiences with the nation's strength and purposes. The strategists of the left, equally obsessed with appearances, believed that gestures of escalating opposition would eventually bring the establishment to its knees. In both cases, politics appeared as a game, the object of which was to communicate the opponent's escalating cost of his personal policies. When he was sufficiently impressed with the cost on this assumption, he would abandon his intransigence in favor of conciliation. Thus, the opponents of the war in Vietnam announced in 1967 with great fanfare that they intended to move from dissent to resistance, expecting that resistance would be countered by repressive measures intolerable to liberal opinion. It will be bloody, said one radical in defense of particularly futile protest, but blood makes liberals mad. Feel familiar? Far from provoking liberal reaction, however, the politics of street feudalists solidified opposition to the left and created a mounting demand for law and order. The escalation of militant tactics fragmented the left and drew the more revolutionary elements into suicidal confrontations with the police and the National Guard. We are working to build a guerrilla force in the urban environment, the National Secretary of the SDS announced in 1967. In fact, the SDS was laying the groundwork for its own collapse 2 years later. The delusion that street theater represented the newest form of guerrilla warfare helped to ward off an uneasy realization that it represented no more than a form of self-promotion, by means of which media stars of the left brought themselves to national attendance with concomitant rewards. One exponent of guerrilla theater, after exhorting his followers to live by their wits, quickly explained, to live by your wits is not to imitate the hustler who is a low-class capitalist, but rather the Latin American guerrilla who is a low-class socialist. Such talk only served to reassure the faithful, but to play up the relevant audience of black and third world militants to which white left had become unduly sensitive and to which it had desperately wanted to impress with its revolutionary machismo. The rhetoric of black power corrupted the right left and the black left alike. Substitution and politics of media of the civil rights struggles earlier waged in deadly earnest in the South, as black power politicians co-opted the civil rights movement. They also captivated white liberals who sought to appease guilt associated with white skin privilege by adopting the gestures and language of militancy. Both white and blacks embraced a radical style in place of a radical substance. By 1968, the New Left gathered for the Festival of Life outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The prominence of the Youth International, led by Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, made it clear that theatrical conception of politics have driven the rational conception from the field. Yippee, it's a Gestalt theater of the streets, Rubin has claimed, compelling people by example to change their awareness. Entering a congressional hearing room in a Paul Revere costume or wearing judicial robes to court of proceedings is a way of acting out fantasies and ending repression. Acting out fantasies does not end repressions. However, it does merely dramatize the permissional limits of antisocial behavior. In the 60s and early 70s, radicals who transgressed these limits under the illusion that they were fermenting insurrection or doing Gestalt therapy on the nation, in Rubin's words, paid a heavy price, clubbing, imprisonment, public harassment are death itself. In the case of terrorists, the Weathermen and the recruitments to the Sudanese Liberation Army, who followed the logic of guerrilla theater to its inevitable ending. Yet these radicals had so few practical results to show for their sacrifices, they were driven to conclude that they were embracing radical politics in the first place, not because it promised radical results, but because it served a new mode of self-dramatization. Now, there's a lot of editorializing in that. And I do think we live in a different time. Like I said, Lasch thinks the culture of narcissism is a personality of late Fordist interaction, where your business personality and you're cultivating in business is a kind of identification of the institution in yourself, a kind of, in classical Freudian psychoanalysis, a secondary narcissism. But we might be dealing with a primary narcissism, which was a hollowing out of the self into a brand and emptying out. Now, I am a big proponent of times where you need to empty out yourself. In fact, I will even say that most selves are constructed illusions anyway, and in many cases, I probably disagree with some crucial Lasch points. And yet on this, I find so much of the same thing happening. We have real confrontations of violence becoming theatrical compensations, but the often ending again in violence. We have NGOs emerging but unable to coalesce to actually represent the movements and hashtags in which they initially came to represent. How many BLM NGOs are there? And why aren't any of them the party of George Floyd? Which is not to say that they all don't do good work. Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them have been riddled with financial scandals, and others do good charity work like any NGO. But they don't speak for BLM. No one does. The hashtag actually follows out to its logical implications and is easily recuperated as such. Think about the limits of Occupy Wall Street. Itself started as an ad busters gimmick. When it came to violent confrontation into the cops, led itself to the kinds of politics that happened outside of the National Democratic Convention in 1968. And while one may praise or condemn David Graeber, his talk about how the occupation was the goal is very similar, in that the occupation is a theatrical act, not a new society. And if you confuse the two, even from an anthropologist lens, you have missed something profound, because that is not a society that can reproduce itself. This is what I pull from Lasch. Not that everything he says is one-to-one applicable to America now, but that what the New Left went through and what we are going through are spiraling distant mirrors. And without real breakdowns in both the theoretical understanding and the real logistics of what is going on, you can't prevent this from going a similar way. But why? Our media landscape is completely different. What is it in the logic of our current society that enables us to emerge and get more clear? Why is everyone LARPing? And how is it just self-promotion? I have many friends on the left who say they don't trust the media left, and I am right that they don't, but they tell me there's mass politics, and I find that latter assumption to be weird. There might be mass eruptions, and they are large in number, of something like politics, but they don't congeal. In so much that forms institutions of dual power or mutual aid, these institutions so far have never built enough capacity to be beyond their region, much less international. And that bind is a limit, which leads people to go and preach party, but they preach party within a legal system of which they do not understand or even have a concrete plan for how they would create such a party, as there is only one third party that has ever been successful in American life, and that is the Republican Party, and it came in the context of a civil war. Now, this tradition goes all the way back to the UK, And even many multi-party parliamentary systems tend to fall down in roughly two factions, with broad parties representing this and that in coalitions, but larger parties basically remaining static, even in places where first past the post voting is reduced. There's a kind of structural logic to this kind of representation, a hollowing out and a simplification. But ask ourselves, what are the economic trends that drive this? Why can we not build effective community work? Why is it so hard to do? Why is the scale so difficult? These are questions that must be answered, but to be answered, they must actually be asked. We must deal with the fact that this performance has actually led a lot of people to miss what was actually going on. Just like from Bernie campaign to Bernie campaign, we thought the left was growing, when it actually seemed like the Democratic center of a lot of the left liberal parties of the world were actually solidifying. The response to increasing crisis and stress put on by a number of factors, from environmental to geopolitical, all of which have cascade failure written all over them. Ask yourself, though, why this goes back so far. Because my contention is this doesn't start with the ultra globalization movement. This doesn't start with Occupy Wall Street, and it doesn't start with the Bernie campaigns. This is a logic that has been going on the entirety of Bernie Sanders' life. And the man is old. We must deal with the structural logics. Mostly we find them in the economic domain, but we can't limit ourselves to that. The separation between culture, politics, and economics is itself a misleading representation. They all are feedback loops on one another. Even if one believes in the base and superstructure metaphor, there are elements of things we call culture and politics in the base. Relations of production are parts of modes of production. But how do you get there, and why? What are the relevant questions to ask?